that warehouse that was in the movie, the set, NASA denies that that ever existed.
Yeah, of course. I mean, of course they're going to deny it. You know, NASA's going to come out kicking and screaming before they admit to anything. NASA is another political organization laced with occult overtones. I mean, they lie. If you watch a NASA news conference, it's bizarre. I mean, it's almost as if they do a ritual before the press conference and one after. It's really bizarre. But from my understanding, there are some places where I know Bart Sabril mentioned one. There's also Flagstaff, Arizona, where they built a 2-square-mile replica of the Apollo 11 landing site. And that was used probably to transform that into other areas of the moon where the mission supposedly landed. So it's really not that difficult to fake when you have the cooperation of the mainstream media. I mean, where did we get our information from back in 1969? Well, we got it from Walter Cronkite on CBS, all right? At that time, we had no capability of seeing the rocket beyond 60 miles. It was out of camera range. And at that point, they were using graphics and cartoons. And we were told what was going on by the mainstream media via Walter Cronkite. And who's Walter Cronkite? Well, he's, of course, one of the most famous CBS anchormen who was also CIA. So, you know, connect the dots, folks.
Let's talk about the lunar training. There are a whole bunch of variables here. Like they had to practice landing and taking off from the moon, you know, with the lunar module, etc. You had the astronauts practicing. Did they get injured? Did they know what they were getting into?
You see, here's another thing that people need to factor in. Look at the average age of the Apollo astronauts. We're looking at astronauts in their mid-late 30s, some in their early to mid-40s at the time of the Apollo missions. Does anybody have a problem with that? I do. You have the best fighter pilots you have are in their early 20s to mid-20s because they're young. Their bodies can withstand the elements and the forces put on them. Now, put an astronaut in that same situation. You want the youngest, fittest astronaut you can have in order to tolerate the elements of space. A fighter pilot goes through nothing compared to what you would go through in the vacuum of space with all the elements that you're faced. Right? So I believe, and I use this as speculation in my third book, I believe that they were recruited in their 30s and early 40s and for their rank as military pilots because, number one, they'd be easier to control. Number two, they knew before they signed on that this was what was going to happen. And, you know, they could have told them anything. You know, you're military, you're doing this for your country, we need to beat the Russians, so on and so forth, you know, that old line, right? So we need to beat the Russians to the moon type of thing. But I really strongly believe that they have dropped hints over the years themselves and let things slip out that all was not right within NASA and the Apollo program. Most famous being Buzz Aldrin. I mean, he lets things slip left and right. I mean, the man, it's frustrating for the intelligence agencies to have to, you know, deal with Buzz Aldrin because he just lets things happen. No, we didn't go. Alan Bean was asked, and I think it was by Bart Sabril actually, in a press conference, did you have any experience of going through the Van Allen belts? And he said, well, no, we didn't go out that far. He was politely told, well, you had to have gone through the Van Allen belts, the radiation belts, to get to the moon. And he said, oh, yeah, you're right. No, there was no effects. This is Alan Bean, okay? Apollo 12, I believe it was Apollo 12, who should have known that the most perilous part of that whole flight would have been going through the Van Allen belts. For those of you out there that don't know, the Van Allen belts are named after a scientist by the name of James Van Allen, and it's very intense radiation. 2 belts, very intense radiation that surround the Earth, and you have to go through those intense radiation belts in order to get to the moon. All right? And those radiation belts have been formed there for millions, billions of years, and they've accumulated a lot of very intense radioactive particles. So you need a lot of shielding to get through that.
I was asking now about the lunar training. So they had to also practice on that lunar module.
Yeah. So here's the thing about the lunar. You're talking about the lunar training vehicle that they built on Earth. Yeah. So that was a lunar training vehicle that they built on Earth to simulate, to give the astronauts some practical training besides simulator training. What's very interesting about that is that they spent 90% of their time flying that vehicle just to keep it in the air and 10% simulating what it would have been like to land a vehicle on the lunar surface. It became so hazardous. Did you know that Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, of course, the first two that landed on the moon, Buzz Aldrin never had any training whatsoever on a lunar landing training vehicle? What if there had been some kind of incident where Neil Armstrong was incapacitated? Buzz Aldrin would have had to take over. Yet he had no training on the lunar training landing vehicle. That was abandoned halfway through the Apollo missions because it was a disaster. It was a flying disaster. And there was a couple of crashes involved in the lunar training vehicle. So, and I document that in my second book. NASA itself said the program was ended while they were halfway through sending missions to the moon.
I heard that Neil Armstrong himself almost died.
Yeah, I'm not sure now if he was even flying that. I think that might have been just for PR.
Right.
I highly doubt that they would let their prized possession, he was selling the program, just his image was selling it. I highly doubt that they would have allowed him to even fly that. But to give the benefit of the doubt, anybody can go online and find that film, videos online of him bailing out and parachutes to safety. And of course, the vehicle crashed into the ground. And it was shortly after that, I think it was about a year after that, they ended that program.
Neil's an interesting one because he didn't ever really do interviews after the whole thing. I think he became a recluse.
Yeah. So I based my main character in my third book. I based my character on Neil Armstrong. I don't know. I always had an element of respect for Neil Armstrong. Who knows why he was involved? Maybe he was compelled to be involved. He was the poster child for the Apollo missions. It's not something he wore very well. He didn't like his photo being taken on the lunar surface itself. You see the two of them jumping around, but you see a very prominent photo of Buzz Aldrin on the moon, but you don't see Neil Armstrong in any still photos. He refused to have his shot taken. That tells you a lot. Was he worried about anything liable happening to him? That's a very important point. He rarely gave interviews. Basically, he resigned his commission after the Apollo missions. He went into teaching, became a recluse. I mean, he gave an interview once every year or once every 2 years, and when he did, it was carefully choreographed and scripted. He would reluctantly attend, commemoration ceremonies, so on and so forth. His exposure to the public was very controlled, and he wanted it that way. You would have thought that, okay, here's the first man to land on the moon. You would have thought that he would have been in every school, every high school,
yes,
every college, every university, jumping for joy, celebrating, trying to inspire people to get involved. Look what we did, rah, rah, rah. And there was none of that. It was the complete opposite. And if you look at the press conference that Apollo 11 crew gave 2 weeks after they landed, after they splashed down, it is the most depressing press conference I've ever seen. And I mean ever. You thought they would be jumping for joy. And
that's one of the things I've never understood. I mean, supposedly the greatest event in human history, and they don't look happy or excited, and they don't do interviews, and they become reclusive and all sorts of weird things.
Yeah. Again, it gets into speculation, but I try to put myself in their shoes. Like I try to look at, well, what kind of pressure were they under? I do know they made a lot of money. They made a lot of money on the side, by using their brand, selling things, making commercials and things like that, and using their name to sell products. Take the third astronaut with the Apollo 11. You had, what is his name? Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and the other one escapes me right now. He loved it. He loved the limelight, but Neil Armstrong did not. Mm-hmm. And it tells me that he might have been coerced into participating in the Apollo missions and then wanted nothing to do with it. He did his part and got out. But there are a lot of strange behaviors. You have Buzz Aldrin, and I'm not mocking Buzz Aldrin for his alcoholism, but you wonder, what he too was going through in all of this. And did that drive him to drink it? We all have alcoholism in our families, and it's nothing to make fun of. And I don't like it when we make fun, when my community does. The people I know personally haven't. But for those of you that want to make fun of Buzz Aldrin, don't. It's not funny. So I try to put myself in their shoes to see what it is they were going through, what drives a person to that mental and emotional state that they have to drink.
On the day, Randy, there were a lot of people there. They saw the rocket. The rocket went up. What happened that day? I
believe that there was an estimated 2 or 3 million people that were there to watch the launch of Apollo 11. And of course, CBS and Walter Cronkite was there with his commentary. I strongly believe that there was no one on that rocket. Bart Sabril, others will disagree with me. I believe there was no one on that rocket. I do believe that they went through the motions. I talk about this. Fiction's a great way to speculate. I speculate as to how they actually did it. They couldn't take a chance on putting a crew on board that rocket. It was too dangerous.
Nobody would have known. You're standing far away. You can't see if those 3 astronauts are actually walking into the module, or can you?
No, you can't. But you have close-up footage of them walking into the module, but we don't know what happened after that. And the cameras are so far away. So a lot of people don't know is that there was an escape chute from the Apollo capsule. So the astronauts could have easily gotten out or been helped out after the cameras left, because then there's that hour countdown, right? And there's an escape chute that goes from the top of the command module, the tower, down to a bunker that's 40, 50 feet underground, reinforced, that can withstand nothing short of a nuclear attack. And in the case of an accident or in case of an incident, I don't know how they would get out of the rocket on time. There was an incident with one of the engines, but they would use the emergency escape chute down to that tunnel and that bunker underneath the launch pad. There's a bunker right underneath the launch pad, 40, 50 feet under. And that bunker can sustain life for a full week. So I suspect that's a scenario I use in my book, that after the cameras had left, then the astronauts were taken out of the rocket, removed their spacesuits, and slid down the chute into the underground bunker, and they stay there until things settle down. That's my personal belief. I know there's other people that have their own speculation on this, but I do know, and I'm almost sure, there was no one on board Apollo 11 when it launched.
Yeah, I think Bart, he argues that they were on board, but they just went into orbit and then came back a few days later. Although, I mean, either way, the argument is that they didn't go. And yes, the thing though, how would anybody actually know? Because you can only look up so far. The rest of the trip, you'd have to rely on NASA.
Yeah, again, gets into some other interesting territory. You have NASA's now pushing the whole idea that there were amateur astronomers, not only astronomers that work for companies that are funded by government. So, of course, they're going to say, yeah, we saw the spacecraft on the way to the moon. Look at our telescope here. We'll show you the photos. Well, of course, they're working for government-funded institutions. Of course, they're going to promote the status quo and the official narrative. But now they're saying that there's amateur astronomers. It's interesting, though, how you never hear their names or not much of their names anyway in their backgrounds, and nobody took a photo. And now you also have ham radio operators said that they were picking up communications between NASA and Houston Control. I could tell you right now, if this had been a real mission, they would have been using frequencies that were not accessible from ham radio operators. Those would have been classified. It would have been carefully scripted before it was released to the public. And same goes to the space shuttle. NASA lets you hear what they want you to hear. Okay, so I pretty well debunked all of that nonsense as well. Nobody saw those missions. You wouldn't be able to tell. I can't tell a 707 from a 747 at 30,000 feet up, flying over, and it's a hell of a lot bigger than a spacecraft. I mean, the command module is about the size of an average small car.
I've read articles that say that the Saturn rocket that was used on the day was underpowered. Now, you said earlier that the Saturn V was the most powerful rocket. What's going on there?
I said it was the most powerful rocket, according to NASA. I didn't say it was actually in reality. The Saturn V was underpowered. I think they were trying to get something out of the F1 engines. I believe there might have been more than 2 launches, but unmanned missions of the F1 engines. I think there was another purpose for that. When I say it was the most powerful rocket ever built, yes, NASA says it's the most powerful rocket ever built, but in practice, was it actually used? I believe no, it's not. I believe Bill Casing was right from the very start when they used less powerful engines. And people say, well, we heard the roar. We were miles away and we heard the roar at launch. Well, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference between an H1 roar and an F1 roar. One is a smaller engine, the other one's a larger engine. You wouldn't be able to tell the difference between the two. You would just, as an observer, as a layperson observer, hear the roar of the engines. And then NASA conditions your mind to believe that you're actually hearing the F1 engine. So yes, the most powerful rocket ever built. It's billed as the most powerful liquid fuel rocket ever built. It hasn't been anything since. They still have one or a couple on display. They should reverse engineer that engine because they're having problems with the new powerful one now. But that's another story. So when I say yes, the most powerful, that's on paper, but in practice, no.
Now, if somebody asked the question, okay, you claim that it's underpowered, but what are your metrics? What are you gauging it with?
I talk about this in book 1. And say, here we go again. People say, well, the Russians had to know something about it. They would have said something about it. Well, here you have Russian scientists coming out, writing very extensive articles and describing why this engine didn't work, but they won't believe that. They need to hear it from Putin, I guess. They need to hear it from a politician before they believe it. But when a scientist comes out and says it, they don't want to listen. So I documented one Russian scientist who analyzed both the Apollo 4 launch, which was the Saturn V launch, and the second unmanned launch, which was Apollo 6, Saturn V launch. And he noticed Apollo 6 was plagued with problems, and he was able to determine by looking at film footage and photographs and looking at the technical design of the engine that they were having serious problems with the combustion chamber within the F1 engine, that it was very unstable. In fact, you have NASA engineers that have admitted that if there was a crew on board the second Saturn V launch, they would have either been killed or they would have abort anyway. The vibration from the disruption of the F1 engines not working properly was that bad. They would have had to abort or they might have been killed outright. So he does a 60-page article. I talk about it a lot. And he goes through all of these specifications and the technological aspect of the F1 engines, and he describes in detail why those engines failed. And as I said, they were having a problem with the combustion chamber of the F1 engines. Just to give your audience a little bit of information here, inside the combustion chamber of the F1 engines is what is called a controlled explosion. That's where you see the flame coming out the nozzle. So that controlled explosion reaches temperatures of about half the temperature of the surface of the sun. You need to cool that down. You need to stabilize that because that kind of temperature is going to distort the combustion chamber. And if you have a distortion of the combustion chamber, you have an explosion of the engine and you lost the whole rocket. So they had to cool that down. It was that part that the scientists had determined was not working properly. The cooling system to keep those temperatures stable was not functioning properly. And that's what led to the near disaster of the launch of Apollo 6.
You touched on JFK earlier. Was there a link between his assassination and the Apollo mission?
A month before JFK was assassinated, he had ordered NASA administrator at that time to meet with his counterpart in Russia, in the Russian space program. And he was seeking full cooperation with the Russians on a manned mission to the moon. In other words, what he was doing is he was laying the groundwork. He actually signed a memorandum to that effect, which is, again, it's in my second book. And he was laying the groundwork for open cooperation between the Russians and the Americans. Now, I say open because I don't think it was the sole reason why he was assassinated, but it was maybe a contributing factor because he was revealing a lot. But when I say open, I actually believe the Russians and the Americans were already working together on their respective space programs, and they were sharing information back and forth. Kennedy was talking about bringing that out in the open. That's the difference, and that's what I was talking about.
So in the 60s, they had a very tight deadline, basically the end of 1969. Assuming that everything you're saying is correct and they didn't go, could they have gone if they had more time?
No, not with this technology. And some within my own research community might disagree with me on this, but my answer to that is a flat no. With the technology we have today, you cannot safely send manned missions through the radiation belt surrounding the Earth. Not to mention you have powerful coronal mass ejections and solar flares coming from the sun. Not to mention that you have micrometeorites as a potential hazard. Not to mention galactic cosmic rays, which come from outside the galaxy and are coming in and constantly bombarding planets. That's why we have a magnetic field, because it deflects 95% of that. And anything else gets through the north and south poles and it goes into orbit in our magnetic field, hence the radiation belts. So no, with present day technology, we cannot get through the Van Allen belts. I'm not talking about unmanned missions, I'm talking about manned missions specifically. When they talk about a mission to the moon, it's not going to happen. NASA's now projected its schedule to work by 2030. They want to have regular flights, manned missions back and forth to the moon. It's not going to happen. In fact, I will add that the NASA Inspector General has himself come out and said that the schedule for NASA today is unrealistic. So they're already laying the groundwork to cancel these flights.
Which means that nobody's going to go to Mars either.
Fairy tale. You read it in a book. You'll have much more fun. But it's a fairy tale for the masses. It's opium for the masses. And I think a lot of people are now coming around to that realization. And a lot of people are now seeing that for what it is. I mean, it's interesting now that the numbers of people who believe the Apollo missions were faked has gone up a lot. And in Britain, I think it's over 50, 60%.
There is a lot to cover, Randy. We've only spoken about the pre-missions effectively, and we could go on for hours, but your books contain a lot more. Where can I get them?
The books are available on Amazon.com. All 3 books are available on Amazon.com. The first one is called The Apollo Moon Missions, Hiding a Hoax in Plain Sight, Part 1, and then there's Part 2 to that as well. And my latest book is Apollo, the real mission, and that was co-written by Robin Landry. And I just want to add something that I would just want to publicly thank Robin Landry, because I didn't think I could do fiction, and she was very helpful with me on that. She's a phenomenal fictional writer herself, and she's very much in tune with what you and I are talking about. So she was the perfect person to do this. So there's a YouTube channel. He actually takes my videos and he puts them on, edits them. But for those of you out there, the Apollo Detectives YouTube channel has all the information you require. He has a lot of people like myself on there. It's not my channel, it's his channel. He likes the work we're doing. Marcus Allen from Nexus Magazine, he's on there, and you get a lot of information. If you want to do some catching up on that, that's your go-to channel, your go-to source. So I highly recommend that channel for people that want to actually, who don't want to read the books, but maybe want to go to the channel. So, everybody has their preferred format.
Randy Walsh, thank you for joining me in the trenches. Trenches.